Shane is a 1953 Western film that starred Alan Ladd, Jean Arthur, Van Heflin, and Brandon DeWilde. It's considered a timeless Western classic. The movie's rich color cinematography captures the beautiful environment of the legendary frontier, with it being filmed in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and it showcases its blue-gray Grand Tetons as a backdrop. The veteran producer and director George Stevens' film is often considered the second film of his American trilogy, which is positioned between A Place in the Sun from 1951 and Giant from 1956. This widescreen Technicolor masterpiece creates a symbolic myth, the age-old story of the duel between good and evil, the advent of civilization with families, law and order, and homesteaders, and the progress into the wilderness, where there's a world of roaming cattlemen, lawless gunslingers, and loners on horseback. We experience the land dispute conflict between a homesteader and a cattle baron, and the coming of age of a young boy. The film is dotted with classic sequences, like the uprooting of a stump in the yard, or Tori's murder in a muddy street and his hilltop funeral. The straightforward narrative of the film is told and seen mostly through the eyes of the young, impressionable hero, who idolizes a mysterious, gunslinging hero from the wilderness who appears out of nowhere, a man that has no past or a future. The theme song of the film, The Call of the Fairway Hills, parallels the backdrop of the entire story. The movie was completed in 1951, but George Stevens' editing process was so rigorous that it wasn't released until 1953. This drove up the cost of the film on what should have been a simple, straightforward Western, making the cost spiral so much out of control that Paramount approached Howard Hughes about taking over the property, but he declined on it. He changed his mind when he saw the rough cut of the film, and he offered to buy it on the spot. This made Paramount rethink its strategy. Originally, the movie was going to be released as a B picture, but they decided it should be one of the studio's flagship films of that year. This proved to be a very good decision, as the film was a major success and easily recouped its inflated budget. The director originally cast Montgomery Clift as Shane and William Holden as Joe Starrett. When both of them decided to do other films instead, Shane was nearly abandoned before Stevens asked studio head Y. Frank Freeman who was available that he could use. Upon seeing a list of actors under contract with the studio, Stevens cast Alan Ladd, Van Heflin, and Jean Arthur within minutes of each other. Meticulous care was given at all levels of the production. All the physical props were true to the period. The buildings were built to the specifications of that time, and the clothing was completely authentic. The director even had somewhat scrawny-looking cattle imported in from other areas, as the local herds looked too well fed and healthy. This is really noticeable when you're viewing this project because the cattle are so scrawny. You can see their bones sticking out everywhere. The first gunshots in the film are when Shane shows Joey how to fire a revolver. To enhance the dramatic effect of the shooting, the sounds of the gunshots were elevated by firing the gun into a garbage pail. This caused it to echo and made the gunfire sound much louder. The director's intention was to startle the audience with the very first firing of the gun. Jack Palance had problems dealing with his horse during filming. He wasn't that familiar with riding a horse at the time. When Shane and Jack first look each other over at the Starrett Ranch, Palance was supposed to dismount for a minute and then remount his horse, but he couldn't remount the horse, so the director had Jack dismount the horse slowly, and then he ran the film in reverse for the remount. In the funeral scene, the dog consistently refused to look into the grave. Finally, director George Stevens had the dog's trainer lie down at the bottom of the grave, and the dog played his part perfectly then. The coffin, loaded with rocks for the appropriate effect, was then lowered into the grave. But when the harmonica player began to play Dixie and the scene came completely together, the crew was so moved by the shoot that they began shoveling dirt into the grave before remembering that the dog's trainer was still down there. Shane's fancy gun twirling in the climactic showdown scene was actually performed by Rod Redwing. Earlier, when Shane demonstrates his prowess for Joey, it is clearly Alan Ladd himself on camera. The actor had been given a different, easier-to-use revolver for that scene. Alan Ladd was famously short for a Hollywood star, around 5'6", whereas Ben Johnson was 6'2". For many of the barroom shots, Ladd had to stand on risers in medium or close-up shots. The telltale signs of this are that in some of the face-to-face shots where Ladd and Johnson's heads are even, but Ladd's belt buckle is much higher than Johnson's. Also, there's a shot where one of the risers can be seen briefly when the character Pete tells Chris that he's superstitious and gets up from the table, leaving an embankment visible along the floor next to the bar. Now, Jean Arthur was a big animal rights person, and during the production, it was actually halted for a while when a piglet became sick, and Jean Arthur refused to work until it was taken to a veterinarian hospital. The piglet sadly died, though, but fearing that Arthur's reaction might be a negative one, the production heads hid this from her and replaced it with a very similar-looking animal. She was never told that the original pig died. Now, the two main stars of the show are Alan Ladd, who plays Shane, and Brandon DeWild, who plays the young boy Joey. Brandon DeWild was all the rage at this time. He was one of the hottest young talents on the Hollywood scene. As time went on, he began getting smothered by Hollywood, as so many of these young actors do. He turned to drugs to relieve him of the problem, but it basically wrecked his Hollywood career. Eventually, he got sober and started working again on stage productions and was excited about the new life ahead of him. He got married again, but on July 6, 1972, while he was in Colorado for a Denver stage production, he was killed in a traffic accident in the suburb of Lakewood. He was driving a camper van by himself, not wearing a seatbelt. The camper van left the roadway, striking a guardrail and a parked truck. The van rolled onto its side and pinned him underneath the wreckage. He was taken to a hospital where he died at 7:20 p.m. that night. He was only 30 years old. And then there was the title character of Shane, played by Alan Ladd. He was everybody in Hollywood's golden boy. He was blessed with strawberry blonde hair and a dashing photogenic smile that he over time had cultivated into a very smooth persona. He was struck with tragedy in 1937 when his mother asked him if she could borrow some money from him, and she went into a drugstore and bought poison and drank it in the back seat of his car. She basically killed herself in front of her own son. He immediately turned to alcohol to cope with this trauma. In November of '62, Ladd was found lying unconscious in a pool of blood with a bullet wound near his heart. The bullet had penetrated his chest, went through his lungs, and bounced off his rib cage. He stated that he had heard a prowler, grabbed a gun, and tripped and accidentally shot himself. This was the official version that police accepted when they investigated this incident. But most people think that he tried to take his own life at that time. In January of 1964, he was found dead by his butler in his Palm Springs residence. This was due to an acute overdose of alcohol, barbiturates, and 2 different kinds of tranquilizers. After all was said and done, the death was ruled completely accidental. He was 50 years old. What a tragedy to lose these 2 very talented actors that went down the same slippery slope that you see so many of these stars go. Take a look at this 1950s classic Western. You have to love it. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.